Ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of Trafalgar, fought on October 21st, 1805, did not occur in isolation. It was a pivotal event within the larger framework of the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts that engulfed Europe from 1803 to 1815. These wars stemmed from the turmoil of the French Revolution, which had upended monarchies, sparked new ideas of liberty and equality, and unleashed a wave of political change across Europe. Amidst this upheaval, Napoleon Bonaparte emerged as a dominant force. Rising from the chaos, he became Emperor of the French in 1804, his ambitions extending far beyond the borders of France. By the early 19th century, Napoleon sought to establish French dominance over Europe. His armies had already swept through much of the continent, toppling old regimes and redrawing national boundaries. Austria, Prussia, and Russia all faced the relentless advance of French military power. Only Great Britain stood firm against his ambitions, an island nation whose naval strength and economic resources posed the most serious obstacle to Napoleon's vision of a continental empire. The relationship between Britain and France had long been marked by rivalry and conflict. For centuries, these two great powers vied for global influence, whether through colonial competition, trade, or warfare. By 1805, this rivalry had reached its peak. While Napoleon dominated the land, Britain reigned supreme at sea. This maritime dominance was not simply a matter of pride, it was essential for Britain's survival. With no land border connecting Britain to mainland Europe, the Royal Navy became the nation's primary defense against invasion. Napoleon recognized this reality. To achieve his ambition of invading and conquering Britain, he needed to break British naval superiority. The key to his plan lay in controlling the English Channel, the narrow body of water separating southern England from northern France. For months, Napoleon amassed a vast invasion force along the French coast, preparing to strike. However, there was one crucial obstacle: the Royal Navy's blockade. British warships patrolled the waters of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, preventing French and Spanish fleets from joining forces and threatening the British Isles. In 1805, Napoleon devised a bold plan. He ordered the French fleet stationed in Toulon to break out into the Atlantic, join with the Spanish Navy, and lure the British away from the Channel. If successful, this maneuver would allow his invasion force, 200,000 soldiers, to cross the sea unchallenged. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, was tasked with delivering this decisive blow. But standing in their way was the Royal Navy, an experienced, disciplined force that had spent years honing its skills on the high seas. The stakes could not have been higher. If Napoleon's plan succeeded, Britain would fall, and with it, the last major obstacle to French domination of Europe. If it failed, Napoleon's dream of controlling the seas, and with it, his hopes of global hegemony, would be shattered. The battle that unfolded off the coast of Cape Trafalgar would decide the future of the continent. This was not just a military confrontation, it was a clash of empires, ideologies, and ambitions. On one side stood Napoleon's vision of a unified Europe under French rule. On the other was Britain's determination to maintain its sovereignty and preserve the balance of power. The Battle of Trafalgar was more than a fight for maritime dominance. It was a struggle for the very future of Europe itself. The Battle of Trafalgar was not just a confrontation between ships. It was a titanic struggle between two competing visions of power at sea. On one side stood Great Britain, a nation whose maritime heritage and naval supremacy had been carefully built over centuries. On the other stood the combined fleets of France and Spain, two formidable naval powers allied under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. Each side brought not only ships and sailors to the battle but also deeply entrenched national ambitions and strategic objectives. Great Britain's Royal Navy had long been the backbone of the nation's defense and the key to its global influence. Since the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, Britain had steadily expanded its naval capabilities, recognizing that control of the seas was vital for both national security and international trade. By the early 19th century, the Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force in the world. Its ships patrolled the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean, protecting British trade routes and colonial holdings. This dominance did not come easily. It was earned through decades of investment in shipbuilding, rigorous training, and the experience gained from continuous warfare during the 18th century. At Trafalgar, the British fleet was a model of professionalism and discipline. The men who sailed under the Union Jack were not merely sailors. They were part of an elite fighting force trained to endure the hardships of life at sea and to execute complex naval maneuvers under fire. British ships were known for their superior gunnery and well-drilled crews. The Royal Navy's doctrine emphasized speed, accuracy, and aggression, enabling them to deliver devastating broadsides with remarkable efficiency. Furthermore, the British naval command structure was built on merit and experience. Unlike other European navies, where positions were often secured through aristocratic privilege, British officers rose through the ranks based on skill and combat success. This fostered a culture of boldness and innovation, qualities that would play a decisive role at Trafalgar. The British fleet was also organized around a clear strategic vision to prevent any rival power from challenging British control of the seas. For the Royal Navy, the Battle of Trafalgar was not just about defeating an enemy, it was about securing the future of the British Empire. In contrast, the Franco-Spanish alliance represented a combined force assembled by necessity rather than natural partnership. Napoleon Bonaparte, despite being a master of land warfare, recognized the importance of naval power. However, the French Navy had suffered significant setbacks throughout the Revolutionary Wars. Years of political turmoil following the French Revolution had disrupted naval training and depleted the ranks of experienced officers. By 1805, the French fleet was being rebuilt under Napoleon's direction, but it remained weaker and less cohesive than its British counterpart. The Spanish Navy, while historically powerful, had also declined from its former glory. Economic struggles and political instability weakened its capacity to maintain a modern fleet. Nevertheless, Spain's geographic position and large number of warships made it a valuable ally to Napoleon. By joining forces, France and Spain hoped to challenge Britain's naval supremacy and clear the path for a French invasion of the British Isles. Despite their combined strength, the Franco-Spanish fleet faced serious disadvantages. Unlike the British, who had been continuously active at sea, their fleet spent much of the time blockaded in port. This meant that their sailors lacked the combat experience and cohesive teamwork that came from regular naval engagements. Additionally, the two navies operated under different chains of command, leading to communication difficulties and divergent tactical approaches. At Trafalgar, these weaknesses would prove fatal. The sheer scale of the battle reflected the enormous resources committed by both sides. The British fleet consisted of 27 ships of the line, supported by 4 frigates. These massive warships, each bristling with cannons, were the backbone of the Royal Navy's striking power. Although the British were outnumbered, their superior organization and battle-hardened crews gave them a decisive edge. In contrast, the Franco-Spanish fleet brought 33 ships of the line into the fight, 18 French and 15 Spanish. On paper, this numerical advantage should have translated into a strategic upper hand. However, many of their ships were poorly coordinated, and their crews were less experienced in battle conditions. The size of the Allied fleet also made it more difficult to maneuver effectively, especially against the bold tactics the British would employ. The battle was more than a military encounter. It was a clash between different naval philosophies. The French and Spanish adhered to traditional linear tactics, favoring defensive formations and careful coordination. The British, however, emphasized offensive action, preferring to engage at close quarters and disrupt enemy formations. This difference in approach would shape the course of the battle and ultimately determine its outcome. As the sun rose on October 21st, 1805, the stage was set for a battle that would decide not only the fate of these rival navies, but also the future balance of power in Europe. The British fleet, disciplined and determined, faced the larger, but less cohesive Franco-Spanish armada. The waters off Cape Trafalgar would soon become the scene of a decisive confrontation, one that would echo through history for generations to come. The Battle of Trafalgar, fought on October 21st, 1805, was not just another clash between naval powers, it was a battle with far-reaching consequences that extended beyond the open seas. At its core, Trafalgar was about far more than simply defeating an enemy fleet. It was a struggle over the future of Europe, the survival of Great Britain, and the balance of global power. Understanding the battle's strategic importance requires examining the broader context of the Napoleonic Wars, the political landscape of the time, and the critical role that naval dominance played in shaping the ambitions of empires. At the beginning of the 19th century, Europe was in turmoil. Napoleon Bonaparte, having declared himself Emperor of the French in 1804, sought to dominate the continent. His military genius on land was virtually unmatched, and by 1805, much of Europe either bowed to France or stood in uneasy opposition. Austria, Prussia, and Russia remained locked in a precarious position, while Great Britain, protected by the sea, was Napoleon's most persistent and dangerous enemy. For Napoleon, invasion of Britain was the ultimate prize. If he could cross the English Channel and bring his powerful land armies to British soil, the last major obstacle to his continental dominance would crumble. The British, however, knew that their survival depended on maintaining control of the seas. Without it, their island nation would be vulnerable to invasion. Furthermore, British global influence, rooted in maritime trade and overseas colonies, was entirely reliant on the freedom to navigate and protect shipping routes across the world's oceans. Napoleon's grand plan rested on the ability to neutralize the Royal Navy. For years, the British fleet had imposed a naval blockade on French ports, preventing France from effectively using its navy and strangling its trade. This blockade not only restricted the movement of French ships but also weakened the French economy. Napoleon knew that to break the blockade and secure the channel for an invasion, he needed to combine the French and Spanish fleets and deliver a crushing blow to British naval power. The plan was both ambitious and bold. Napoleon ordered Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, commander of the French fleet, to join forces with the Spanish Navy and lure the British fleet away from the Channel. By drawing British ships into distant waters, Napoleon hoped to create a window of opportunity for his vast invasion force, which was gathering at Boulogne, to cross the Channel unopposed. If the plan succeeded, British independence would be extinguished, and the final road to European domination would be open. For the British, the stakes were nothing less than national survival. If the Franco-Spanish fleet could gain command of the seas, even temporarily, Napoleon's invasion forces would sweep across the Channel. Britain had no standing army large enough to repel a French invasion of that scale. The Royal Navy was the only shield that protected the nation from conquest. Beyond defense, Britain's economic and imperial interests depended on maritime supremacy. The nation's wealth flowed from trade routes that connected its colonies in India, the Caribbean, and North America. Losing control of the seas would not only expose Britain to invasion but also threaten its global position as an economic powerhouse. The consequences of failure were profound. A successful French invasion would mean the collapse of British political institutions, the destruction of centuries-old liberties, and the end of Britain as an independent nation. Moreover, the balance of power in Europe would shift permanently in Napoleon's favor. A French-dominated Europe would suppress any opposition and extend imperial ambitions across the globe. The Royal Navy, therefore, had a clear and urgent mission: prevent the French and Spanish fleets from gaining control of the seas at any cost. The Battle of Trafalgar represented the climactic moment in this struggle. If the British fleet failed to destroy or neutralize the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, the path to invasion would open. If they succeeded, Napoleon's maritime ambitions would be shattered, and his dream of conquering Britain would be postponed, perhaps indefinitely. In many ways, the future of Western Europe hung in the balance, with Trafalgar serving as the decisive point where these opposing ambitions would clash. The battle also had significant implications beyond Britain and France. Other European powers closely monitored the outcome, knowing that British defeat would mean an unchecked French empire dominating the continent. Conversely, a British victory would keep Napoleon confined to the land and preserve the fragile coalition of powers resisting his expansion. For nations like Austria, Prussia, and Russia, The Royal Navy's ability to contain Napoleon at sea was essential to maintaining their sovereignty and their hopes of eventually defeating him on land. Global trade and commerce also rested on the outcome of Trafalgar. Britain's ability to enforce a maritime blockade not only weakened France, but also protected its own expansive trading networks. If the Franco-Spanish fleet had broken British control of the seas, it would have imperiled British colonies and disrupted the flow of goods and resources that were vital to the economy. A British defeat would embolden French privateers and naval raiders, further threatening commercial shipping and global stability. Thus, the Battle of Trafalgar was not an isolated naval encounter. It was a turning point in the broader struggle for European dominance and global influence. Victory for the Royal Navy would mean the continued protection of British shores and the preservation of an empire built on maritime supremacy. Defeat, on the other hand, would open the door to invasion, the collapse of the British state, and the triumph of Napoleonic tyranny across Europe and beyond. As the combined fleets of France and Spain sailed toward the coast of Cape Trafalgar, and as the British fleet prepared to meet them, every sailor on both sides understood the gravity of the moment. This was a battle where the fate of nations would be decided, where the control of the seas would shape the course of history for generations to come. The Battle of Trafalgar took place on October 21st, 1805, off the coast of Cape Trafalgar, a rugged and windswept headland located on the southwestern coast of Spain. This stretch of the Atlantic Ocean, where the battle unfolded, holds both geographic and strategic significance. It lies near the entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow waterway that connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. This location was not chosen by chance. It was the result of months of complex naval maneuvering and strategic calculations by the opposing fleets of Great Britain and the Franco-Spanish alliance. Cape Trafalgar itself is a striking promontory, its rocky cliffs rising sharply above the sea. Situated approximately 32 kilometers, 20 miles southeast of Cadiz, the Cape's location along the Spanish coastline made it a vital maritime landmark. For centuries, the nearby Strait of Gibraltar had served as one of the most important maritime passages in the world. Whoever controlled these waters held the key to the Mediterranean, giving access to vital trade routes between Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. For both the British and the French, command over this region was not simply a matter of prestige, it was a matter of strategic necessity. By 1805, these waters had become a crucial theater in the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy had maintained a naval blockade on French and Spanish ports, particularly Toulon and Cadiz, to prevent their fleets from combining and threatening British dominance. The British fleet's ability to control this region was pivotal to protecting trade routes and defending British colonies in the Mediterranean. At the same time, Napoleon Bonaparte understood that breaking this blockade and gaining control of the seas was essential if he were to carry out his invasion of Britain. The location of the battle was also shaped by weather patterns and maritime geography. The waters off Cape Trafalgar were notorious for their unpredictable winds and strong currents. In the early 19th century, naval engagements relied heavily on wind power to maneuver large sailing vessels. Captains and admirals needed to anticipate these environmental factors when positioning their fleets. The prevailing westerly winds off the Atlantic coast of Spain made it challenging for ships to navigate swiftly, adding an element of uncertainty to any naval confrontation in these waters. In the days leading up to the battle, Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, commander of the Franco-Spanish fleet, sought to evade the British blockade by sailing from Cadiz. His orders from Napoleon were clear: break free of the British fleet, sail toward the English Channel, and secure naval superiority to pave the way for an invasion of Britain. However, Villeneuve's fleet struggled with poor coordination and inexperienced crews, making swift movement difficult. As his ships attempted to leave the safety of the Spanish port, they were closely shadowed by the British fleet under Admiral Lord Nelson. Admiral Nelson understood the strategic importance of intercepting the Franco-Spanish fleet before it could escape into the open Atlantic. He positioned his fleet carefully, using the natural geography of the region to his advantage. Cape Trafalgar, with its prominent headland and proximity to the Strait of Gibraltar, became the ideal location to confront the enemy. By blocking their path, Nelson could prevent Villeneuve from reaching the English Channel and crushing Napoleon's hopes of launching an invasion. The geography of Cape Trafalgar also influenced naval tactics during the battle. The British approach from the west meant that they sailed directly into the combined Franco-Spanish line, which was stretched out parallel to the coastline. Nelson took advantage of the open sea to execute his bold and unconventional strategy of dividing the enemy fleet into two sections. This maneuver would have been far more difficult in confined waters or closer to shore. The open expanse off Cape Trafalgar gave the British fleet the space it needed to break through enemy lines and engage in close-quarters combat. The location also placed logistical pressures on both fleets. The British fleet had been at sea for many months, blockading French and Spanish ports and maintaining constant vigilance over enemy movements. This required significant resources, fresh water, food supplies, and repair materials, all of which were difficult to replenish far from home. The Franco-Spanish fleet, by contrast, had access to nearby ports such as Cadiz, but their crews lacked the same level of experience and preparedness that came from continuous operations at sea. The decision to engage near Cape Trafalgar had profound strategic implications beyond the immediate battle. Control of these waters allowed the British to secure maritime dominance in the western Mediterranean and maintain their blockade on France's southern coastline. This effectively trapped French and Spanish naval forces, preventing them from threatening British trade routes or supporting Napoleon's continental ambitions. For Napoleon, the failure to seize control of the seas near Cape Trafalgar meant that his grand invasion plans were permanently thwarted. Furthermore, the location of the battle had symbolic significance. For centuries, the seas surrounding Gibraltar had been contested by rival European powers seeking to dominate global trade. By choosing to confront the enemy off Cape Trafalgar, Nelson sent a clear message. The Royal Navy was prepared to defend Britain's maritime interests at any cost. Victory in these waters would not only protect the British Isles from invasion, but also cement British naval supremacy for generations to come. As the sun rose over the Atlantic on October 21st, 1805, the stage was set. The calm but determined British fleet approached from the west, while the larger Franco-Spanish armada lay stretched across the horizon. The winds, the currents, and the geography of Cape Trafalgar would all play a role in shaping the battle that was about to unfold, a battle that would decide the fate of Europe and the future of global power. The Battle of Trafalgar was a monumental clash between two naval superpowers, the Royal Navy of Great Britain and the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. Both sides brought formidable forces to the battlefield, yet the composition, training, and leadership of each fleet reflected stark differences in experience, strategy, and tactical capability. These contrasts would play a decisive role in shaping the course of the battle and ultimately determining its outcome. The British fleet, under the command of Admiral Lord Nelson, consisted of 27 ships of the line, the largest and most powerful warships of the age, along with 4 frigates for reconnaissance and support. Each ship of the line was a floating fortress, armed with 64 to 100 cannons, capable of delivering devastating broadsides. Despite being outnumbered by the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, the British advantage lay in discipline, training, and leadership. The Royal Navy sailors were battle-hardened veterans who had spent years at sea enforcing Britain's naval blockade against France and Spain. British warships were renowned for their speed, maneuverability, and superior gunnery. The sailors' constant exposure to combat conditions meant they were skilled in handling their guns with rapid precision. In the heat of battle, the ability to reload and fire quickly was a crucial advantage, and the Royal Navy's crews could discharge up to 2 broadsides every minute, a rate of fire unmatched by their opponents. This level of efficiency was not merely the result of superior technology, but stemmed from a culture of relentless training and practice. Another key strength of the British fleet was its organizational structure and tactical innovation. Unlike the rigid hierarchical traditions of other European navies, British command emphasized merit and combat experience. Many of the officers in Nelson's fleet had risen through the ranks based on skill rather than social status, creating a highly capable leadership corps. This system fostered adaptability and boldness, qualities that would be crucial in the unconventional tactics Nelson employed at Trafalgar. In contrast, the Franco-Spanish fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, comprised 33 ships of the line, 18 French and 15 Spanish, along with 7 smaller vessels. On paper, this numerical superiority should have provided a significant advantage. The Spanish ships, in particular, were among the largest and most heavily armed in the world. Notable among them was the Santissima Trinidad, the largest warship afloat, which boasted 140 guns across 4 decks. However, the size of the Franco-Spanish fleet was deceptive. It concealed profound weaknesses that would be exposed during the battle. One of the most critical flaws of the Franco-Spanish fleet lay in its lack of cohesion. The alliance between France and Spain was one of convenience rather than shared purpose. Communication and cooperation between the two navies were hampered by language barriers, differing tactical doctrines, and rivalry between officers. This lack of unity made it difficult to coordinate complex maneuvers and respond effectively to British aggression. In a battle where rapid decision-making was essential, these divisions proved costly. Another significant weakness was the inexperience of many French and Spanish crews. Years of British naval blockades had confined their fleets to port, depriving sailors of the opportunity to train under real combat conditions. While the British fleet had been continuously active at sea, the Franco-Spanish crews lacked the same level of preparedness. Many ships were manned by hastily assembled sailors who had little experience in handling complex naval artillery or executing intricate maneuvers. This inexperience extended to the officer class, where many commanders had gained their positions through political favor rather than proven skill. Moreover, the training methods of the Franco-Spanish fleet were outdated compared to the Royal Navy's rigorous drills. British gunners could fire their cannons 3 times faster than their adversaries, giving them a substantial advantage in the chaotic, close-quarters combat that would define the Battle of Trafalgar. This disparity in firepower and efficiency meant that, although the Franco-Spanish fleet had more ships, they were at a disadvantage when it came to the speed and accuracy of their broadsides. Logistical challenges further weakened the Franco-Spanish fleet. Their months of inactivity in port had caused serious supply shortages, leading to poor morale among the crews. Essential resources such as gunpowder, food, and fresh water were often in limited supply, and many ships were not fully combat-ready. In contrast, the British fleet, despite spending long periods at sea, was kept well supplied through a robust and efficient logistical network. This ensured that British crews were not only better equipped but also better nourished and healthier than their Franco-Spanish counterparts. Leadership was another area where the two fleets differed markedly. Admiral Lord Nelson was a bold and imaginative commander known for his willingness to take risks and defy conventional tactics. His strategy at Trafalgar was revolutionary. Rather than following the traditional approach of engaging in parallel lines, Nelson planned to divide his fleet into 2 columns and break through the enemy's line, isolating and overwhelming individual ships. This aggressive approach was designed to maximize the British fleet's superior gunnery while sowing confusion and disorder in the enemy ranks. By contrast, Vice Admiral Villeneuve was a cautious and indecisive leader. His appointment as commander of the Franco-Spanish fleet had been a contentious decision by Napoleon, who doubted his boldness and ability to face the British in open combat. Villeneuve's hesitation to engage the British fleet during the months leading up to Trafalgar reflected this uncertainty. Even on the day of battle, his decision to maintain a defensive line rather than adopt a more flexible formation played into Nelson's hands, leaving his fleet vulnerable to the British assault. Despite their numerical superiority, the Franco-Spanish fleet faced internal divisions, inexperienced crews, and weaker leadership. The British, although outnumbered, possessed better-trained crews, faster gunnery, and a fearless, innovative commander. These differences in capability, organization, and tactics would determine how the battle unfolded and, ultimately, which navy would emerge victorious. As the fleets drew closer to one another on the morning of October 21st, 1805, the wind filled the sails of over 60 warships, their decks crowded with thousands of sailors preparing for the deadly clash ahead. The British approached with determination and confidence, knowing that their very survival depended on victory. Meanwhile, the Franco-Spanish fleet, stretched in a long and vulnerable line, faced a relentless enemy ready to shatter their hopes of controlling the seas. The balance of naval power and the future of Europe hung in the balance. The Battle of Trafalgar was not only a test of strength between two great naval powers, but also a contest of tactical brilliance and strategic vision. At the heart of the British victory lay Admiral Lord Nelson's bold and unconventional approach to naval warfare, a strategy that broke with centuries of tradition and demonstrated a deep understanding of naval dynamics and human psychology. Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar were revolutionary in their conception and execution, and they played a decisive role in shaping the outcome of the battle. By the early 19th century, the dominant doctrine of naval warfare was the line of battle formation. In this traditional tactic, opposing fleets would form parallel lines of warships and engage in a broadside-to-broadside exchange of cannon fire. This method emphasized discipline and coordination, allowing fleets to maintain structural integrity while delivering sustained volleys of firepower. It was a strategy that required careful maneuvering and precise communication, but it often led to inconclusive engagements where neither side could decisively defeat the other. However, Nelson recognized the limitations of the line of battle tactic. He understood that victory against a larger and better positioned enemy required a more aggressive and disruptive approach. Rather than simply mirroring the Franco-Spanish fleet's line, Nelson devised a radical new strategy designed to break the enemy's formation, isolate individual ships, and maximize British firepower. This plan was not only daring but also strategically brilliant. It turned the enemy's numerical advantage into a tactical liability. Nelson's plan was built around two attacking columns, which would advance perpendicularly toward the Franco-Spanish line rather than engaging it in parallel. One column, under Nelson's direct command aboard HMS Victory, would strike the center of the enemy's line. The second column, led by Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood on HMS Royal Sovereign, would target the rear. This bold maneuver aimed to split the Franco-Spanish fleet into isolated groups, preventing them from supporting one another and creating chaos within their ranks. By cutting through the line, the British would be able to engage enemy ships at close quarters, where their superior gunnery and faster rate of fire would prove devastating. Once the line was broken, British ships could surround and overwhelm their opponents, striking from multiple angles and delivering continuous broadsides. This approach transformed the battle from a rigid, formal exchange into a series of fierce, close-quarters engagements, where British skill and discipline would prevail. One of the most innovative aspects of Nelson's strategy was his understanding of shock and confusion as a weapon. By attacking in this unorthodox manner, he sought to disrupt the command structure of the Franco-Spanish fleet. Communication at sea during the Age of Sail relied on signal flags and prearranged orders, which became difficult to interpret during the heat of battle. By breaking the enemy's line and forcing individual ships to fight independently, Nelson effectively paralyzed the ability of the Franco-Spanish commanders to coordinate a unified response. Moreover, Nelson's plan relied on concentration of force against vulnerable sections of the enemy fleet. Rather than engaging all enemy ships simultaneously, the British would strike specific points along the line with overwhelming firepower. This tactic allowed Nelson to neutralize key ships quickly and prevented the Franco-Spanish fleet from using its numerical advantage effectively. By focusing his attack on the center and rear, Nelson left the van, the leading section of the enemy line, isolated and unable to return to the fight until it was too late. Another key element of Nelson's strategy was his careful consideration of weather and wind conditions. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, the winds off Cape Trafalgar were light and unpredictable. Nelson positioned his fleet upwind of the enemy, giving him the ability to control the pace and direction of the engagement. By advancing in columns rather than in line, the British fleet maintained greater maneuverability and could exploit wind shifts to their advantage. This deliberate positioning allowed Nelson to dictate the terms of the battle from the outset. Nelson's tactics also reflected his deep trust in the competence and initiative of his captains. Before the battle, he famously issued his General Memorandum, in which he laid out the principles guiding the British approach. While he provided a broad framework for the engagement, he encouraged his captains to act independently and seize opportunities as they arose. This decentralized command structure gave the British fleet a crucial advantage in adaptability. When conditions changed or unexpected challenges emerged, individual captains could respond swiftly without waiting for further orders. The human element was another critical component of Nelson's strategy. He recognized that morale and motivation could be as decisive as firepower. On the morning of the battle, Nelson raised his now immortal signal. England expects that every man will do his duty. This message, visible across the fleet, inspired the British sailors and reinforced their sense of duty and unity. For men who had spent years at sea defending their homeland, these words carried profound emotional weight and a clear reminder of the stakes involved. In contrast, the Franco-Spanish fleet relied on a more rigid and defensive posture. Under Vice Admiral Villeneuve, their formation followed the traditional line of battle, stretching across the horizon. While this formation allowed for mutual support between ships, it also made the fleet vulnerable to the kind of disruptive assault Nelson had planned. Villeneuve's leadership style was cautious and reactive. He sought to avoid a decisive battle but found himself outmaneuvered and forced into action. The weakness of the Franco-Spanish strategy lay in its inflexibility. Once the British columns pierced the line, the combined fleet struggled to maintain cohesion. Villeneuve's defensive mindset meant that his ships were not positioned for an aggressive counterattack. Many French and Spanish captains were inexperienced and lacked the initiative to adapt to the rapidly evolving battle. As the British pressed their advantage, the Franco-Spanish formation descended into disorder, with ships isolated and overwhelmed. Nelson's tactical brilliance was rooted not only in his boldness, but also in his meticulous planning and deep understanding of naval warfare. His strategy was designed to exploit the Royal Navy's strengths, superior gunnery, disciplined crews, and agile command, while exposing the weaknesses of the enemy. By rejecting conventional tactics and embracing innovation, Nelson transformed what could have been a grinding engagement into a decisive and overwhelming victory. As the British columns advanced toward the enemy line, their sails billowing in the morning breeze, Nelson's strategy was about to be tested in the most dramatic fashion. The success or failure of his bold plan would not only determine the outcome of the Battle of Trafalgar, but also shape the fate of Europe and the course of history for generations to come. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, the waters off Cape Trafalgar were calm, with a light breeze stirring the sails of the two opposing fleets. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden light across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, where over 60 warships prepared for one of the most consequential naval engagements in history. The British fleet, under Admiral Lord Nelson, approached in two unconventional columns, while the Franco-Spanish fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Villeneuve, stretched in a defensive line across the sea. It was a battle not just of firepower, but of strategy, discipline, and sheer determination. As the British fleet advanced slowly toward the enemy, the tension on board the ships was palpable. The crews, many of whom had spent years at sea under harsh conditions, now faced the ultimate test. At approximately 11:45 a.m., Nelson famously ordered a signal to be hoisted from his flagship, HMS Victory. England expects that every man will do his duty. This brief but powerful message rippled through the fleet, stirring the hearts of the sailors and reinforcing their commitment to victory. For many, the battle was not only about military triumph, but also about defending Britain's sovereignty against the looming threat of Napoleonic domination. The Franco-Spanish fleet, despite its superior numbers with 33 ships of the line, was ill-prepared for the bold tactics Nelson was about to unleash. Villeneuve had organized his fleet in a long, stretched-out line, an approach intended to present a broad front of firepower and maintain defensive cohesion. However, this defensive posture left them vulnerable to Nelson's aggressive plan. The British columns, advancing perpendicular to the enemy line, aimed to break through the Franco-Spanish formation, isolate individual ships, and engage them at close quarters. At around 12 o'clock noon, the battle began in earnest when the leading ship of Collingwood's column, HMS Royal Sovereign, broke through the Franco-Spanish rear. Collingwood, commanding the leeward column, led his ships with characteristic boldness, smashing into the enemy formation and opening fire on the massive Spanish warship Santa Ana. A thunderous broadside erupted from Royal Sovereign, tearing into Santa Ana's hull and sending splinters and debris flying across the deck. The Franco-Spanish fleet, caught off guard by the ferocity of the British attack, struggled to maintain their defensive line as chaos began to unfold. Simultaneously, Nelson's column, led by HMS Victory, bore down on the center of the enemy line. Victory's target was Bucentaur, Villeneuve's flagship, which found itself in the heart of the battle. At 12:45 p.m., Victory broke through the Franco-Spanish line and unleashed a devastating broadside against Bucentaur at point-blank range. The sheer force of the volley shattered the French ship's stern, killing or wounding over 400 men in a single blow. With its command structure crippled and many of its guns disabled, Bucentaur was left vulnerable and exposed to further punishment. As the British columns pierced through the Franco-Spanish line, the battle descended into fierce, close-quarters combat. Ship after ship became locked in desperate duels, with cannon fire roaring across the waves and the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. The British, with their superior gunnery and well-drilled crews, fired faster and more accurately than their opponents. Each broadside delivered a crushing blow, reducing enemy ships to wreckage and disarray. One of the most intense confrontations occurred between HMS Victory and the combined firepower of the French ship Redoutable and the Spanish Santissima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world with 140 guns. Victory, despite being under withering fire, held its position and continued to deliver punishing broadsides. Meanwhile, the French crew of Redoutable attempted to board Victory, leading to brutal hand-to-hand combat on the decks. British Marines, stationed in the rigging, poured musket fire onto the French sailors below, repelling the assault with fierce determination. Throughout the battle, the disorganization of the Franco-Spanish fleet became increasingly apparent. Many of Villeneuve's captains hesitated to engage, while others failed to respond effectively to the British breakthrough. The vanguard of the Franco-Spanish fleet, under Admiral Gravina, remained isolated from the main action due to the confusion caused by the British assault. This allowed Nelson and Collingwood to focus their firepower on the center and rear, where the enemy's command structure had begun to crumble. As the hours passed, the British maintained their relentless offensive pressure. Ship after ship in the Franco-Spanish line was overwhelmed and forced to strike their colors, a signal of surrender. Some vessels, crippled and burning, drifted helplessly in the tide. The once imposing Santissima Trinidad, surrounded by multiple British ships, eventually succumbed to overwhelming firepower and was captured. Meanwhile, Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaur, battered beyond repair, was also taken by the British, delivering a symbolic and practical blow to the Franco-Spanish command. Amid the din of battle, the bravery and discipline of individual sailors on both sides became evident. Gun crews toiled tirelessly to reload and fire their cannons despite the smoke, fire, and carnage around them. Surgeons worked frantically below deck to tend to the wounded, while Marines fought fiercely to repel boarding attempts. Yet, even as the British sustained heavy losses, their superior training and morale enabled them to maintain cohesion and continue their assault. The battle's violence was matched only by its chaotic intensity. Ships collided, rigging tangled, and cannonballs smashed through wooden hulls, leaving devastation in their wake. For the sailors caught in the thick of the fighting, the reality was one of noise, blood, and confusion. The sea itself became a graveyard for the fallen, as bodies and debris drifted amidst the shattered remains of once mighty warships. Despite the confusion, Nelson's plan was unfolding as intended. The Franco-Spanish line had been shattered, and their fleet was now broken into isolated fragments. British captains, following Nelson's guidance, acted independently to seize opportunities and press their advantage. This flexibility allowed the British to respond swiftly to changing conditions and prevented the enemy from regrouping or mounting a coordinated counterattack. Throughout the engagement, the British fleet demonstrated exceptional seamanship and tactical discipline. Even as individual ships became embroiled in fierce duels, the overall strategy remained intact. The British advantage in gunnery speed, maneuverability, and command initiative steadily wore down the Franco-Spanish resistance. As the battle raged into the afternoon, it became increasingly clear that the British were on the path to total victory. As the sun reached its zenith, the smoke of battle hung thick over the waters off Cape Trafalgar. The shattered remnants of the Franco-Spanish fleet drifted in disarray, their hopes of breaking British naval dominance slipping away. For Nelson and his fleet, the battle was far from over, but their bold tactics, superior gunnery, and indomitable spirit had already turned the tide decisively in their favor. The Battle of Trafalgar was shaped by a series of pivotal turning points, where bold decisions, unexpected events, and acts of extraordinary courage determined the course of the conflict. These moments were not simply tactical milestones. They were the culmination of years of naval experience, strategic insight, and the sheer willpower of those engaged in combat. Each turning point tipped the balance further in favor of the Royal Navy, gradually dismantling the Franco-Spanish fleet and ensuring an outcome that would echo through history. One of the most significant turning points came at the very beginning of the battle when Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, commanding the leeward British column aboard HMS Royal Sovereign, became the first to break through the Franco-Spanish line. While naval convention dictated that fleets engage in parallel, Collingwood, following Nelson's radical strategy, led his ships directly into the enemy formation. At approximately 12 o'clock noon, Royal Sovereign cut through the line and fired a devastating broadside into the Santa Ana, the flagship of Admiral Alava. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Santa Ana's decks were torn apart, and her ability to effectively return fire was crippled. Collingwood's bold maneuver not only caused confusion within the enemy ranks, but also demonstrated the success of Nelson's plan to divide and conquer. By breaking through the line, Collingwood created a breach that other British ships exploited, setting the stage for the disintegration of the Franco-Spanish defensive formation. A second crucial turning point occurred when HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship, broke through the enemy line and engaged Bucentaur, the flagship of Admiral Villeneuve. This move placed the British fleet at the very heart of the enemy's command structure. At 12:45 p.m., Victory unleashed a double-shot broadside at point-blank range into the stern of Bucentaur, inflicting devastating casualties and disabling many of the French ship's guns. The explosion of fire and iron shattered Bucentaur's upper decks, and within moments, the ship's ability to maneuver and defend itself had been fatally compromised. This direct assault on the enemy flagship not only weakened the Franco-Spanish leadership, but also caused widespread confusion as other ships scrambled to respond. With Villeneuve effectively neutralized, the ability of the Franco-Spanish fleet to coordinate a coherent defense began to unravel. Another decisive moment occurred during the fierce clash between HMS Victory and the French ship Redoutable. Redoutable, under the command of Captain Jean Lucas, was a smaller but highly disciplined vessel known for its fearsome close-quarters combat. As Victory and Redoutable became entangled, the French crew launched a boarding action, attempting to overwhelm the British flagship. For a moment, the tide of battle seemed to hang in the balance. However, British Marines stationed in Victory's rigging poured down musket fire on the exposed French deck below, repelling the boarding parties and causing heavy casualties. This fierce defense not only saved Victory from capture, but also disrupted Redoutable's momentum. The arrival of HMS Temeraire, another British ship, sealed Redoutable's fate by delivering a devastating broadside that left her crippled and eventually forced her surrender. This intense engagement demonstrated the superiority of British training and the resilience of Nelson's fleet under extreme pressure. One of the most dramatic turning points came when the Santissima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world, found itself surrounded by multiple British ships. This mighty vessel, with her 140 guns, was a symbol of Spanish naval power, but her size also made her slow and vulnerable to the agile British attackers. Isolated from the rest of the Franco-Spanish fleet due to the chaos caused by Nelson's breakthrough, Santissima Trinidad endured repeated broadsides from ships such as HMS Neptune and HMS Prince. Despite her formidable armament, the Spanish giant was overwhelmed by the relentless British assault. As her decks were devastated and casualties mounted, her captain was eventually forced to strike his colors, an unmistakable sign of surrender. The capture of this flagship was not just a symbolic victory, but also a tactical triumph, further demoralizing the Franco-Spanish forces and depriving them of a key asset. Another key moment occurred in the van of the Franco-Spanish fleet, where several ships under the command of Admiral Dumanoir were too distant to join the main engagement quickly. Nelson's tactic of focusing on the center and rear of the line left these leading ships effectively isolated. By the time Dumanoir recognized the danger and attempted to bring his ships back into action, the British had already achieved significant gains. His delayed response not only reduced the effectiveness of the Franco-Spanish fleet, but also ensured that the most intense fighting remained concentrated where the British had the advantage. This failure to act decisively allowed Nelson and Collingwood to maintain local superiority, where their ships could overwhelm outnumbered enemy vessels without facing a coordinated counterattack. Amid these tactical breakthroughs, another turning point emerged from the disorganization of the Franco-Spanish command. Villeneuve's leadership, already under strain due to Napoleon's pressure and previous defeats, faltered under the intensity of the British assault. Many Franco-Spanish captains were inexperienced or hesitant to engage fully, while others misinterpreted or failed to receive orders due to the confusion caused by the battle's chaotic conditions. The inability to respond to Nelson's aggressive tactics compounded the Franco-Spanish fleet's difficulties, leaving individual ships to face the British onslaught alone. This breakdown in communication and coordination created pockets of vulnerability that British captains exploited mercilessly. The cumulative effect of these turning points was a gradual but irreversible collapse of the Franco-Spanish line. British ships, moving with precision and determination, isolated and destroyed their adversaries in detail. As the afternoon wore on, more and more Franco-Spanish vessels struck their colors, the physical and psychological toll becoming unbearable. The decisiveness of the British tactics, targeting the enemy's center and rear, exploiting confusion, and maintaining unrelenting pressure, ensured that the battle unfolded according to Nelson's bold vision. Each of these critical moments reflected not only the brilliance of Nelson's strategy, but also the skill, courage, and discipline of the British fleet. Together, they transformed the Battle of Trafalgar from a dangerous gamble into one of the most significant naval victories in history. At the heart of the Battle of Trafalgar lay the unmatched leadership demonstrated by the British commanders, whose bold decisions and unwavering resolve reshaped the course of naval warfare. Leadership in any battle is a defining factor, but at Trafalgar, the decisive actions taken by the British High Command contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and hesitation displayed by their French and Spanish counterparts. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to make swift and often daring decisions, and to inspire unwavering loyalty from their crews played a pivotal role in securing British dominance. Central to this leadership was Admiral Lord Nelson, whose innovative tactics and bold vision led to a decisive victory. From the outset, Nelson demonstrated a willingness to defy conventional naval wisdom. Traditionally, naval battles were fought in parallel lines, where opposing fleets would exchange broadsides while maintaining a formal structure. However, Nelson understood that this approach would not deliver the overwhelming victory needed to destroy the combined Franco-Spanish fleet and eliminate the threat of a Napoleonic invasion of Britain. Instead, he conceived a radical plan to attack the enemy fleet by splitting their line of battle. This plan aimed to disrupt enemy coordination, isolate individual ships, and force close-quarters combat where the superior training and discipline of the Royal Navy would give them a decisive edge. Nelson's boldness was not limited to his battle plan. It extended to the way he inspired and led his men. Just before the battle commenced, at approximately 11:45 a.m., he famously ordered the signal to be raised from his flagship, HMS Victory. England expects that every man will do his duty. This simple yet powerful message resonated deeply with every sailor and officer in the fleet. It was not merely an order. It was an appeal to national pride, personal responsibility, and collective duty. This declaration, made in the face of grave danger, reinforced morale, and gave the men of the Royal Navy a profound sense that they were fighting not just for victory, but for the defense of their homeland and the preservation of British freedom. Throughout the battle, Nelson's personal leadership was visible and direct. Rather than commanding from the relative safety of the rear, he positioned HMS Victory at the center of the action, making his ship one of the first to engage the enemy. This was a deliberate risk, as he knew his presence at the heart of the battle would inspire his men and demonstrate his confidence in their ability. He rejected the idea of wearing the plain attire of an ordinary officer, instead donning his full admiral's uniform, including the brilliant stars and medals that clearly identified him as the fleet's commander. This was an act of courage. By making himself so easily recognizable, he knowingly made himself a target for enemy sharpshooters. But for Nelson, the psychological impact of leading by example outweighed the personal danger. His visibility on deck and his calm demeanor under heavy fire reassured his men, encouraging them to fight with tenacity and bravery. Complementing Nelson's leadership was Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, who commanded the leeward column of the British fleet aboard HMS Royal Sovereign. Collingwood's leadership style was marked by steady determination and tactical brilliance. As the battle began, it was Collingwood's ship that first pierced the Franco-Spanish line, leading the charge against the enemy's rear. This bold move was a testament to his confidence in Nelson's plan and his trust in his own men. Collingwood's aggressive approach put the Santa Ana, one of the largest Spanish ships, under withering fire and began the process of fragmenting the Franco-Spanish formation. His ability to seize the initiative and act decisively was critical to the early success of the British assault. Collingwood's calm and resolute leadership also played a crucial role in maintaining order during the chaotic close-quarters fighting. As the battle raged around him, he directed his fleet with cool precision, ensuring that damaged British ships were supported and that enemy vessels were systematically engaged and overwhelmed. After Nelson's mortal wounding later in the battle, it was Collingwood who took overall command of the fleet. Despite the emotional weight of losing his friend and commander, he continued to lead with discipline and authority, ensuring that the British maintained their advantage until the battle was decisively won. In contrast to the bold leadership of Nelson and Collingwood, the Franco-Spanish commanders were plagued by indecision and poor coordination. Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, leading the combined fleet aboard Bucentaur, struggled to match the dynamism and tactical innovation of his British opponents. Villeneuve's leadership was marked by a cautious and reactive approach, partly due to his awareness of the superior skill of the British fleet and partly due to the intense pressure from Napoleon, who had grown impatient with his admiral's previous failures. This lack of confidence translated into hesitation during the battle. While Nelson advanced with boldness, Villeneuve failed to issue clear and timely orders. The Franco-Spanish fleet remained disorganized and slow to respond, allowing the British to break through their line and isolate key ships. Further undermining the Franco-Spanish effort was the lack of unified command. The combined fleet was made up of two distinct national forces, each with its own leadership structure, languages, and traditions. This division hampered communication and cooperation during the battle. While Villeneuve commanded the French contingent, Admiral Federico Gravina led the Spanish ships, but there was little coordination between the two. When the British columns broke through their line, many Franco-Spanish captains were left to make independent decisions, leading to further fragmentation and confusion. Some ships hesitated to engage fully, while others became trapped and overwhelmed. The leadership failures on the Franco-Spanish side were particularly evident in the actions of Admiral Dumanoir, who commanded the van, the leading portion of the Allied fleet. When the British attacked the center and rear, Dumanoir had an opportunity to turn his ships around and come to Villeneuve's aid. However, he delayed taking action, fearing that his ships would be caught in the confusion and possibly destroyed. This failure to act decisively meant that the British could concentrate their firepower on the weaker sections of the Franco-Spanish line without facing significant retaliation. By the time Dumanoir finally attempted to re-enter the battle, it was too late. The outcome was already sealed. The impact of leadership at Trafalgar cannot be overstated. Nelson's innovative tactics, personal bravery, and ability to inspire loyalty gave the British fleet a moral and tactical advantage. Collingwood's steady hand ensured that this advantage was maintained even after Nelson's death. By contrast, Villeneuve's indecision and the lack of unity among the Franco-Spanish commanders left their fleet vulnerable to disruption and defeat. This stark contrast in leadership not only decided the outcome of the battle but also had far-reaching implications for the future balance of naval power. The Battle of Trafalgar was not merely a fleeting moment of military triumph. It was a defining event that reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the wider world. The consequences of this monumental battle extended far beyond the waters off the Spanish coast, influencing the trajectory of global power, warfare, and empire for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of the British victory sent shockwaves through Europe, while the profound long-term effects altered the balance of power on a global scale and laid the foundation for Britain's maritime dominance. One of the most immediate consequences of the battle was the complete destruction of French naval ambitions. Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-declared Emperor of France, had long sought to challenge British naval supremacy and implement his ambitious plan to invade the British Isles. The combined French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar represented his greatest hope of securing control over the English Channel, a prerequisite for any successful invasion. However, the crushing defeat at Trafalgar shattered these ambitions entirely. Of the 33 ships in the Franco-Spanish fleet, 22 were destroyed or captured, while the British fleet did not lose a single vessel. This overwhelming loss rendered the French Navy incapable of challenging the Royal Navy's dominance for the rest of Napoleon's reign. With his fleet in ruins, Napoleon was forced to abandon his plans for an invasion of Britain and instead shift his focus to continental warfare, leaving Britain unchallenged on the seas. This decisive victory established British naval supremacy that would endure for more than a century. With the French and Spanish fleets crippled, the Royal Navy became the undisputed master of the seas, a position that allowed Britain to protect its extensive colonial empire, control crucial trade routes, and project power across the globe. Trafalgar ensured that Britain's naval dominance remained unchallenged, allowing it to enforce maritime blockades and disrupt French supply lines during the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. This supremacy was not only a military advantage, but also a strategic asset that enabled Britain to shape global trade and diplomacy. The Royal Navy became the foundation of what historians later termed Pax Britannica, a period of relative peace across the world during which Britain's naval strength deterred major conflicts and allowed for the expansion of international commerce. The impact on France was profound and far-reaching. The loss at Trafalgar weakened Napoleon's ability to extend his power beyond the European continent. Without a credible naval force to rival Britain, Napoleon turned to economic warfare through the continental system, a blockade aimed at cutting off British trade with mainland Europe. However, the Royal Navy's continued dominance rendered this strategy ineffective. British ships patrolled the seas, ensuring the continued flow of goods and supplies to Britain while choking off French maritime commerce. This naval stranglehold contributed to economic hardship across the French Empire and weakened Napoleon's ability to sustain his war machine. In the years that followed, the British blockade played a pivotal role in the gradual erosion of French power, culminating in Napoleon's eventual defeat at Waterloo in 1815. For Spain, the consequences of Trafalgar were equally devastating. Once a formidable maritime power with a vast colonial empire, Spain's naval capacity was irreparably damaged by the loss of many of its finest ships and experienced sailors. The defeat weakened Spain's ability to defend its overseas possessions, particularly in Latin America, where revolutionary movements were already beginning to stir. In the decades following Trafalgar, Spain's hold over its colonies weakened, leading to independence movements across South America. Without a strong navy to protect and reinforce its empire, Spain rapidly lost control over its once mighty colonial holdings. The battle thus marked the beginning of the decline of Spanish imperial power, a decline from which it would never fully recover. Trafalgar's consequences also extended to the wider European balance of power. With Napoleon's ability to dominate the seas effectively neutralized, other European powers were emboldened to resist his expansionist ambitions. Britain, having secured its maritime dominance, was free to commit resources to supporting continental coalitions against France. Over the next decade, this strategic flexibility allowed Britain to play a central role in successive alliances that eventually led to Napoleon's downfall. The battle thus strengthened Britain's position as a key player in shaping the post-Napoleonic European order, culminating in the Congress of Vienna, 1815, where the victorious Allied powers redrew the map of Europe and established a new balance of power that would last for much of the 19th century. On a global scale, the effects of Trafalgar were equally significant. With its navy unrivaled, Britain was able to expand and consolidate its colonial empire across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Royal Navy's control of key maritime routes facilitated the growth of British trade and the spread of British influence across the globe. In particular, the dominance established at Trafalgar laid the groundwork for the expansion of the British Raj in India and the establishment of colonial territories in Africa and the Pacific. The battle thus became a turning point not only in European history, but in the emergence of the British Empire as the world's preeminent global power. The battle also had a profound impact on the evolution of naval warfare. Trafalgar demonstrated the effectiveness of innovative tactics, such as breaking the enemy's line, and highlighted the importance of close-quarters combat and superior seamanship. The Royal Navy's emphasis on rigorous training, discipline, and gunnery set new standards for naval engagements. This emphasis on tactical innovation and professionalism became the model for future naval forces, influencing naval doctrines well into the 20th century. Furthermore, the battle underscored the importance of command and leadership, as exemplified by the bold strategies employed by the British, while the Franco-Spanish commanders faltered due to indecision and poor coordination. The psychological impact of Trafalgar was also profound. For the British public, the victory became a symbol of national pride and maritime supremacy. Nelson's death during the battle transformed him into a national hero and a powerful symbol of self-sacrifice and leadership. Monuments, such as Nelson's column in London's Trafalgar Square, were erected to commemorate his legacy and the victory that secured Britain's future. For generations to come, the memory of Trafalgar would serve as a rallying point for the Royal Navy and a source of inspiration for Britain's maritime ambitions. Conversely, the battle left an enduring mark on the defeated powers. For France, the loss at Trafalgar became a symbol of their inability to challenge Britain on the seas, reinforcing the limits of Napoleon's reach. For Spain, the battle signaled the beginning of the end of its empire. The trauma and humiliation of the defeat lingered in both nations, shaping their naval policies and national identities for years to come. The geopolitical ripples from Trafalgar reached far beyond the European continent. By securing maritime dominance, Britain could enforce its interests in distant territories, combat piracy, and play a decisive role in the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. In 1807, just 2 years after Trafalgar, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and the Royal Navy began enforcing the ban on slave trafficking worldwide. This humanitarian legacy was made possible by the naval power secured at Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar, therefore, was more than a military engagement. It was a world-changing event that redefined the power dynamics of Europe, solidified British maritime supremacy, and paved the way for the expansion of the British Empire across the globe. In conclusion, the Battle of Trafalgar was far more than a single naval engagement. It was a turning point that reshaped the future of Europe and the world. The battle not only ended Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain, but also secured British naval supremacy for over a century. This dominance allowed Britain to expand its empire, protect global trade routes, and influence international affairs on an unprecedented scale. The victory at Trafalgar was a testament to the power of bold leadership, strategic innovation, and the unwavering determination of the British fleet. Its consequences echoed across continents, shaping the political and military landscape for generations. Even today, the battle stands as a powerful reminder of how courage, vision, and sacrifice can change the course of history forever.